Hi, I'm Spencer Christian. On this episode of Tracks Ahead, we'll go into a basement in Arizona to see a great O-gauge layout which models the three areas of the Grand Canyon State. We'll visit with a man whose vocation was telegraph operator and dispatcher for the Northern Pacific and who has continued to chronicle the history of the line. And we'll head into the hills of Colorado for a most unusual tourist attraction. But first, we'll visit the largest HO layout in the world. It has more than 450 trains with 7,000 cars. It's completely computer controlled with over 5,000 trees and 20,000 feet of track. Where do we have to go to see this? Hamburg, Germany.
Hamburg, Germany is a beautiful harbor city with a history that reaches back centuries. It is a thriving metropolis, Germany's second largest city, its busiest port and one of the country's major industrial and cultural centers. It's also home to the largest model railroad layout in the world. Hamburg's miniature Wonderland is so large and so impressive that it's almost unbelievable. It's a for-profit, open-to-the-public display which has only been operating since the year 2001. It was born in the heart and the mind of Freddie Brown, who loved model railroading as a child and came up with this idea as an adult while on vacation in Zurich in the late 1990s.
I used to spend my holidays in Zurich and walk through the small back streets. I came across a small model railroad shop. I still don't know why I went into that shop at that moment. Just 5 minutes after I had seen all the little trains in the shop, I had the idea to build the biggest model railroad in the world. Immediately I called my brother and told him that I wanted to build the biggest model railroad in the world. He laughed at me and asked if maybe it was too hot in Zurich, and he wondered if maybe I had sunstroke. He didn't believe that I was serious and that I meant business. So I called him 3 or 4 more times. After the 4th call, he realized I wasn't joking. So he started to think about the idea and wondered if maybe we could really do such a project.
So the Browns went to work. They rented space in an old coffee warehouse in Hamburg's historic Speicherstadt, which was once the world's largest warehouse complex. In less than a year, dozens of designers and builders turned the old warehouse into what is now one of Hamburg's major tourist attractions. And it just keeps getting bigger. Time invested so far, more than 150,000 hours. Money invested so far, €4.5 million, or nearly $6 million. The layout is divided into different sections. There's Hamburg, of course. There are the Alps. There are fictional towns and real towns. There's even an American section which includes landmarks and lifestyles from Mount Rushmore to Las Vegas, from the Rocky Mountains to the Miami Heat. Listen to these numbers. An HO layout spread out over 20,000 plus square feet. 500 trains, 2,300 structures and bridges, 10,000 vehicles, 50,000 trees, 60,000 figures. And the mechanics are as impressive as the visuals. Science is as evident as art. Technology is front and center. Every 15 minutes, the layout cycles through a complete day. The sun goes down and the lights go on. The cars have implanted microprocessors which allow them to stop and start on their own. A car can slow down or speed up. Oh, and if it's running low on energy, it automatically goes to get recharged.
Es war eigentlich noch gar nicht am Anfang gedacht mit Lampen und mit Feuerwehrautos. Das kam eigentlich erst mit
It was my dream to have the vehicles that run on the layout controlled by a computer. I wasn't thinking about lights and fire cars. That came later. When we found out we could transfer the data to the vehicles, then we developed all the ideas and functions that we have in place today. The data transfer to the vehicles is simple. It works with magnetic fields and wires built into the roads. That means the vehicles get the data through a contact between the vehicle and the road. The PC always is measuring the speed of the vehicles. If the PC recognizes that the vehicle is running too slow, it sends the vehicle to the charging station. That's where the charge ports close and the vehicle is charged. We have 5 special PC software programs for this layout. One is a standard software program which was adapted to our needs. It's called Railware, and this operates and controls the trains. I've written the rest of the software used for controlling the vehicles, the ships, and for the lights. The lights simulate day, evening, night, and morning. There are more than 100,000 lamps on the layout. It took 2 years to do this. Today I'm very happy that all the software works without any problems.
Well, most important are the computers for us because they virtually run the complete layout. All we do in the morning is just switch the computers on, and the train operators click all the trains on. From that point on, the software runs the trains. It's quite a clever part of software, or clever piece of software, better say, because it knows all its trains and it runs them on a random basis. So we never have the same series of trains in a given amount of time. And this keeps the layout from being boring.
Now, it's difficult to comprehend how such a tremendous layout could get any bigger or better, but that is exactly what's happening. There are still expansion projects in the works, as well as plans and dreams. There's a Scandinavian waterfront area, which, when complete, will be about the size of a 3-bedroom flat with dozens of computer-controlled ships and tons of water.
After that, I think we move on to Switzerland, so a bit further down south. But nonetheless, pretty cool, because we will have the Swiss Alps. Again, a highlight, because they will be a bit higher than normal, covering 2 stories. We'll rip out a big chunk of our floor, about 100 square meters, leaving a gallery around the room where people actually can walk through the Alps.
Most of our visitors spend about 2 or 3 hours here. Most of the guests don't really expect anything. We are so happy if they look closely at all the details and if you see a big smile on their face. We want them to leave the exhibit with a very happy feeling and with a great deal of satisfaction. If I look at them when they're leaving and they have big smiles on their faces, this makes me really happy, because then I know that they like the layout.
Miniature Wonderland is a full-scale fantasy that the train-loving public has embraced. It is ingenuity and creativity. It is the biggest, and it is the best.
Part of the planning for the Scandinavian section involved global positioning stations set in the ceiling so that the ships could automatically navigate to their ports. For those of you who love to see lots of action in model train layouts, this next segment is for you. We're off to Arizona to visit an O-gauge layout that has modeled the 3 areas of Arizona: the high desert, the mining areas around Flagstaff, and the Sonoran Desert, all in a Scottsdale basement.
All model train layouts reflect the unique personalities of their creators. Elliott Klein's Paradise Desert and Western layout is no exception. Take a look.
There are 4 lines on the layout because I wanted a lot of action. I enjoy running trains. I'm a collector, but I'm also an operator. And the more track and the more trains running, the more interesting the layout is to me.
And there's certainly plenty of action here. You can watch trains run for about 20 minutes before you see one repeat its path. There are 20 bridges, so it's not uncommon to see a Union Pacific Northern going over one bridge, while the Santa Fe Super Chief crosses over a Dash 8 diesel on another. This setup could make a train watcher out of anyone. One minute, the Santa Fe Super Chief is soaring past Native American ruins, while the next minute, a steam shay is hauling ore cars up to the Cohiba mine. It's easy to get mesmerized by this 1,400 square foot layout. Elliott captured the rich diversity of Arizona in his O-gauge high rail model layout. It's a miniature rail tour of some of the state's most scenic areas, combining both modern diesel cars and steam locomotives with freight and passenger lines.
The layout really resembles the 3 basic geographic areas found in Arizona. The middle level is high desert, and with the red rocks very similar to the geography that you'd find in Sedona. Then the lower level is reminiscent of the Sonoran Desert, of the Phoenix metropolitan and Tucson metropolitan areas. And of course, the focus of the layout is the mining site. And that mining site is very typical of mining sites that you find throughout Arizona, as well as New Mexico. And this part of the United States is rich with mining history. So that's really a focal point of the layout.
Perhaps Elliot's background in broadcasting had an impact on the rich detail in his layout. A friend helped him come up with the track plan, and he hired a professional who built models for the motion picture business to create the realistic scenery and buildings.
All of the buildings on the layout have been scratch built. None of them are done from kits. So the passenger station is very typical of what was done in the Southwest with regard to the architecture, the adobe architecture that you find in New Mexico and Arizona.
It took 7 months to complete the scenery. When it came to lighting, Elliot's television production experience came in handy again.
The lighting was really important because shadows, I think, can do a lot as far as making things stand out or making things blend in. I believe that the lighting is as important as the scenery itself. There are several non-traditional engineering features in the layout. Most traditional toy train layouts or model train layouts run their track power through the control panel to control the different rail blocks on the layout. I chose not to do that and thereby eliminated half of the bus wiring that was necessary when you run the track power back to the control panel. We used DC relays, and we also used bicolored LED indicators to indicate the switch positions on the layout, red being a switch to a siding and green being a switch to a main line. And the control panel is basically all DC control voltages. There's no track power that runs to that control panel. So that's what really makes it very unique, and it cut the amount of wiring by 50%.
Recently, Elliot added a wireless handheld transmitter that enables him to walk around freely while operating the layout. And that addition led to another idea.
Future plans for the layout include adding several video cameras, probably 4 or 5, and being able to look at the layout as somebody 4 inches tall would look at the layout. I'd also like to put some mobile cameras in the trains so that you have a panoramic view in scale as if you were riding in the cab of a locomotive or sitting in a dining car of a passenger train.
Even if Elliot never changed another thing on this layout, he's still achieved his major goals. The Paradise, Desert, and Western layout is an action-packed ride into the scenic wonders of the Southwest. Filled with technological and artistic wizardry, the layout offers challenges for anyone who simply loves to run trains, or just loves to watch them run.
Elliot also has a radio station in his house using a couple of old Collins transmitters converted to amateur bands. Working as a dispatcher for the Northern Pacific Railroad for nearly 4 decades, Jim Fredrickson has become a living repository of the stories of the men and women who were the backbone of the railroad. We'll meet him in a moment. Created at the site of the Denver-Leadville stagecoach stop in a scenic mountain canyon southwest of Denver in 1915, Tinytown is the largest kid-sized village and railroad in the U.S.
Welcome to Tinytown and Railway, one of the most popular family attractions in Colorado. With all the smiles and laughter going around here, it's difficult to imagine that Tinytown ever had its share of troubles. Located just a half-hour's drive outside of Denver in Turkey Creek Canyon, the railroad has continuously operated since 1989. But its full history stretches all the way back to 1915.
And a gentleman by the name of George Turner owned this property, and he started building small houses, miniature houses, we think for his granddaughter. And the first heyday at Tinytown was during the 20s. It was an all-day trip at that time up dirt roads from Denver. And at that time there were several miniature houses. There was an Indian pueblo, they had Indian dances here, horseback riding.
All was well until the late 1920s and 1930s when 2 floods damaged Tinytown. As if that weren't enough, a terrible fire destroyed all the principal buildings in 1935. Luckily, the flames spared the miniature buildings. But Tinytown would endure a new hardship, this time a man-made one. In 1948, Highway 285 was rerouted from the front of Tinytown, making it much more difficult for travelers to find or even know about the attraction. The once carefree park fell upon hard times. Although Tinytown was restored by a new set of owners, they must have felt discouraged by the lack of business and put it up for sale again in 1966. After 4 decades of highs and lows, Tinytown was closed. There it lay, tucked in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, awaiting a brighter future. But Tinytown would have to endure yet another natural disaster before that. In 1969, it was hit by a devastating flood. This time, everything in Tinytown was reduced to ruins. Somehow, the orphaned Tinytown found another loving family. Lyle Fulkerson, a model train buff and master mechanic, took the village under his wing and began an ambitious restoration. The Fulkerson family regraded the railbed and even widened and deepened Turkey Creek itself. Once again, Tinytown's future looked optimistic. But tragedy struck again in 1977, when a full-sized runaway train killed Lyle Fulkerson in Denver. Devastated by the loss, the family closed the park. For the next decade, there were various unsuccessful attempts to revive the failing little village. Finally, in 1987, a real estate management team adopted this all but forgotten child.
And they auctioned off lots. And people restored many of the original buildings. And it was about 1990 that the train was up and operational again. And since then, we've been open constantly. And each year we've tried to generate enough income to make some nice improvements in the park. And I think the park now looks as good as it ever has, and we're getting some real nice crowds here.
Tinytown is again filled with the sound of laughter. It has expanded to include over 80 miniature structures.
One of our favorite buildings is the firehouse, which was right behind me, and it was built by the Denver firemen, and it came on the scene in about 1990, and it's made so that the little ones can go inside of it. Last year we added the American Gothic. That's a famous building located in Eldon, Iowa, that Grant Wood used for the backdrop of his famous painting. Another interesting building, which is one of the original that's been refurbished, is our little church down in the Pine Grove. We've had 4 weddings at that little church since I've been here, and it's a fun thing to do. We sell a lot of season passes. We have people that come here once a week, those that live close in the area. It's just delightful for children. We also have senior groups come up. It's kind of nostalgic and a step back in time for them. And kids say they want to go to Tinytown. Father's Day, Mother's Day, those are big days for us.
Visitors can choose to ride passenger cars carried by a trim diesel engine or go with the more traditional-looking steam engine. Either way, their 9-minute ride through the Turkey Creek Canyon is a memorable one. Right now, it looks like Tinytown's troubles are all in the past. What once was a railroad built to amuse one little girl now entertains thousands of families each year.
There's something just a little bit unusual about this modest home located on the north side of Tacoma, Washington. Maybe it's the train switch embedded in the front lawn, or the baggage wagon out back, or the Union Station sign leaning against the fence. But once you meet the gentleman who lives here, these things may not seem so strange. You see, the railroad has been Jim Fredrickson's life. Jim worked as a dispatcher for the Northern Pacific Railroad for nearly 4 decades. He's also published 3 books of photographs he took and the stories he collected during that time.
Well, when I finished high school, I had already been working for the Northern Pacific for about 2 years as a call boy, first of all, and then I learned to telegraph. The division telegraph office was right next door to where the call boy's desk was. Every small town had a telegraph station where people could come down and send a Western Union telegram or ship out express. Another very important function of the telegraph operator was to copy train instructions from the dispatcher in Tacoma, write them down, and then deliver it to the trains as they went by.
Jim acquired his first camera and developing kit as a boy during the Depression. They were premiums he earned by selling the Saturday Evening Post. But what drew his love of photography and his love of trains together?
Well, steam engines were so impressive with the smoke pouring from the stack and the noise that they made, and then the rods and the valve gear, all of the motion that they had that you could see. And another thing about steam engines, every railroad designed its own, so that there was a lot of variety. Now the diesel engines are made by just a few manufacturers, and you find the same engines on most all railroads.
As both his home and his books illustrate, Jim Fredrickson has become a living repository of the stories of the men and women who were the backbone of the old Northern Pacific.
I worked at a station at the east portal of the Stampede Tunnel, a place called Martin. The day operator there was Charles McGurk, and he was a grizzled old bachelor veteran up there. And one thing I remember hearing him say was that the NP will never get any of them diesels. This was a year before the first diesel road engine showed up. Bill Dahlberg was really a master throttle artist. Whenever there was a special train like the President of the United States, notably Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1942, Bill Dahlberg would be pulled off of his normal run and put on the presidential special. This was a builder's plate off of a big Northern Pacific passenger engine, the 2609. This 2609 was the favorite engine of engineer Frank Scobie, one of our better engineers. And he told me that once on a troop train he thought he'd see just how fast that 2609 would go, because it was his favorite of NP's passenger engines, and he got it up to 110 miles an hour on a piece of straight track. And another favorite engineer of mine was Ed Foisey. He was our fastest runner. He'd make up more time than anybody else when the passenger train was late. He told me one time that the road foreman of engines had scolded him for going too fast. And he says, I told him, little Jimmy expects me to go that fast, and that's how fast I'm going to go.
And what does Jim put at the top of his list of memories?
Well, the North Coast Limited was our premier deluxe passenger train. Started in the year 1900, and by the time it was done, it had been a named train longer than any other in the country. It had outstanding dining car service featuring a great big baked potato that weighed at least 2 pounds. Much of the time it was run in 2 sections. One section with just day coaches, and the other section was Pullman sleeping cars with a very luxurious lounge car. And it was considered the showcase of the railroad. It gave travelers their impression of Northern Pacific, and we wanted that impression to be good, so the train was outstanding.
Jim Fredrickson has been all about railroads since his childhood and remains so in his golden years. It's not often we see someone's passion so obviously woven into the fabric of their life.
All aboard for the Northern Pacific.
One of Colorado's most cherished landmarks, Tiny Town is open daily during the summer and weekends during the spring and fall. That's it for this episode. Please join us next time for more Tracks Ahead.